All right, everyone. So we're going to get started. So thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Building Culturally Competent Coalitions. This webinar is brought to you by the National Center for Victims of Crime in partnership with the Identity Theft Resource Center. It's been put together as part of the National Identity Theft Victim Assistance Network, the NITVAN program, which is funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. My name is Laura Cook. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance with the National Center, and I've been working with the NITVAN program for the past year or so. So today in part one, we're going to be focusing on membership and outreach. The webinar will be focused on a few broad discussion questions, so we'll be using Poll Everywhere to get input from all of you. Our presenters will explain the process for responding at the start of the presentation. And before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce our presenters today. We have Muro, who is the Economic Justice Policy Coordinator for the Texas Council on Family Violence. Mona joins the Texas Council on Family Violence after working in the family violence and sexual assault field for 9 years, where she provided direct victim advocacy to her survivors. In her position at TCFV, she provides consultation and technical assistance on economic empowerment policies and practices which enhance safety opportunities for survivors. Ms. Muro received her undergraduate degree from the University of Texas at Austin and master's in social work degree from the University of Texas at Arlington. And also today with us, we have Berneta Haynes, who is the Senior Director of Policy and Access at Georgia Watch, where she works to make quality healthcare, financial literacy, and energy programs in civil justice more equitable and accessible for all. An attorney and champion of equity and justice, Berneta brings a unique mix of legal advocacy work, writing expertise, and innovative use of digital journalism to impact pressing consumer issues. Berneta received a JD from the University of Iowa College of Law, a BA in English, Psychology, and Writing from Drury University, and a master's in English from the University of Iowa. Her interest in equity and justice stems from her liberal arts background and research around intersections of race, class, and gender in American culture. And so with that, I will turn it over to Berneta and Mona, who are going to present and chat with you today about this important topic.
Thanks, Laura. I wanted to just take a quick moment and introduce our software that we're going to be using today. As Laura mentioned, we're going to be really engaging the audience in this conversation around building coalitions and building inclusive and representative and equitable coalitions. And so in order to do that, we really want to center this conversation with you guys. And so we are using the Poll Everywhere software. It's a pretty usable tool, so I want to go ahead and just take a quick moment to get people set up. What you can do is either using your mobile phone or your computer, if you're on your your computer device, you can open up on your web browser, www.pollev.com/TCFV, put that into your web browser, press enter, and it'll populate our first question for you. If you want to use your mobile device, you can go ahead and open up a text message and in the phone number section, put 22333. And then in the text content, go ahead and put TCFV, enter, send that message off, and that'll get you connected to our Poll Everywhere software today. If you're joining us as you kind of come on in, the instructions for Poll EV will be at the top of every question. So in case something goes awry and it's not working for you correctly, it'll be listed at the top of each of the slides as we have a question today. So I want to go ahead and get us started. Give folks another 5 or 10 seconds to go ahead and text in and get ready. Our first question is really, we just want to know who's on the call with us today. So again, if you're just joining us and you're popping on to the Poll EV, if you notice at the top of the web page, it will say the instructions to join, which is TCFV, and you'll text the number 2233, or go ahead and use your web software. Wonderful. So we've got folks starting to go ahead and contribute on in. And if you'll share your name, your role, the organization that you work for, that helps us get an idea of who's on the call with us today. Again, we really want to create a human-centered conversation around building coalitions, and so we want to know who's on the call. Julie, from the Retreat, Enough is Enough project coordinator. Melissa, Victims for Justice outreach coordinator. Laura, training and outreach manager. Asian Pacific Islander Domestic Violence Resource Project. Shelley from Legal Services and Outreach Family at Family Abuse Center. Tampa, Florida, Gazelle, Barb, Hands of Hope Resource Center. Some folks from Michigan, Michigan Division of Victim Crime, Maggie, U.S. Attorney's Office, Victim of Witness Specialist, Desiree, thank you so much for joining us. Wonderful.
So this is awesome. This is a very wide a range of folks. Thank you guys for putting your information into Poll EV. I really like this platform just generally. I'm very interested in just what communities do you all identify as being part of? So on the next slide here, you'll see how you can input that information. What communities do you identify as being part of? Ethnic, racial, immigrant, LGBTQ, gender nonconforming, etc. And how do you show up? And how does it show up in how you approach your coalition work? Because we definitely all bring with us a certain background and certain set of ideas and worldview that really has a lot to do with our identities. And it really does inform the way that we approach this work. So I see immigrant communities of color, women. I see some people are typing things into the chat box too, which is totally fine. Women. Let's see, victims of domestic violence. All right, so our identities and life experiences really do impact our work, and we have to be very mindful of what we bring to our work that comes from those particular backgrounds. Myself being African American and from also a working class background and a woman and queer, I know that I bring all of those things to my work, and it informs who I try to reach out to sort of bring into the coalitions and so forth. And just the way that I even engage with my coalitions once we have them sort of everybody brought together. So I see Asian, Pacific Islander, Black women survivors, feminists, DV survivors, okay. All right.
Rural communities, I love that.
I love it.
Sharing that, yeah.
Yeah. And in Georgia, rural is everything. It's a big part of what we do because we're such a rural state. I used to claim more of a rural background myself, but I quite honestly, I can't even really legitimately claim it anymore, even though I am from Arkansas, partly Little Rock, partly rural Arkansas, but it's just been too long to really legitimately claim it. So, all right. So let's go ahead and keep moving forward. We really wanted to just sort of ground this sort of webinar and where everyone is and where everyone's coming from, and to make sure that, as we proceed through the rest of the webinar, that we're all thinking about our own specific spaces that we work in and that we actually personally come from, all right? So first of all, let's just jump in and make sure you guys have a little bit of information about our respective organizations. I'm with Georgia Watch. I'm Senior Director of Policy and Access at Georgia Watch. We are a small nonprofit organization in Atlanta that does work statewide around Georgia on consumer impact issues. We identify these issues as quality of life impact areas, and those areas include access to civil justice, so ensuring that people are not trapped in arbitration agreements unbeknownst to them. It includes financial protection, financial security, which does include doing work to help people protect themselves from identity theft and so forth, but also making sure that people have access to the financial mainstream and are not locked into predatory loan issue, products and things of that nature. Our third impact area is healthcare access and affordability, which explains itself. And then lastly, consumer energy. So really helping people understand power bills and doing work around power bills to make sure that they're more manageable for folks and things of that nature. So folks are not dealing with losing their housing because of a power bill. So our mission is one of equity and justice for all Georgia. That's kind of the vision that we would like to see materialize here in Georgia. And we do that, we go towards that vision. I should say we work towards that vision by protecting and informing consumers so that all Georgians can actually prosper and thrive. And we do grassroots work, so a lot of educating community members at the very sort of grassroots level, but then a lot of grass tops policy work to really sort of represent Georgians' best interest in all of our legislative decision making and administrative decision making. So I will stop there because I don't want to talk too much more about just generally what Georgia Watch does. I will say that in terms of coalitions, we lead several coalitions, which is it's interesting to be juggling multiple coalitions as one organization. One of our coalitions that we lead that I'll be talking about a lot today is the Georgia Identity Theft and Cybercrime Coalition, our newest one. We also lead the Georgia Financial Protection Coalition and the Georgia Community Health Worker Advocacy Coalition. So I will stop there and turn it over to Mona. And you're muted, Mona.
There I am. Okay. I'm so glad that you mentioned the kind of multi-hat coalition aspect there, because that's one of the things that I think is interesting with respect to the vantage point that I'm approaching the coalition work and my perspective today. So I'm Mona with the Texas Council on Family Violence, and the Texas Council on Family Violence, we refer to as TCFV, is actually the State Domestic Violence Coalition for Texas. And so we're a membership-based program that has over 100 different domestic violence programs that we provide services to. And we do that kind of a multi-pronged approach. We have a service to provider department, which essentially is really doing the on-the-ground work with our domestic violence providers, advocates, executive directors. We also have a prevention team that goes out and does a lot of community-based work. And then I sit on our policy team here at TCFE, and my kind of official role and capacity is working with economic justice initiatives. And so that takes a lot of different forms. And through that economic work, we primarily do technical assistance, policy work, training, and looking at the intersections of system work, in particular for domestic violence, and how systems are helpful and or are not serving the needs of survivors. And so I come to this conversation today, one, with my TCFE hat on as a state domestic violence coalition staff, but also as a partner to our Texas coalition, of course, which is what we refer to as TCCD. And that's the particular coalition that I will also be using examples from today. This TCCD was the official NITBAN grantee and was the coalition that was really funded to do specific work. And so with that hat on of the TCCD hat, TCFE was a partner agency alongside 3 other organizations, which is Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, or what we refer to as TRALA. It's a pro bono legal services provider in the state of Texas. Texas Legal Services Center, which is also another pro bono legal service organization in the state of Texas, and then Texas Appleseed. And so Texas Appleseed is an asset building organization that also serves Texas. And so us 4 were the 4 primary partners that banded together to create a kind of partnership and are kind of the founding kind of organizations that helped to launch the TCCD. And TRALA specifically was the NITBAN grantee that received the funding to support and really, really served as the kind of founding organization and really did a lot of the heavy lifting with respect to the coalition. And so we're very grateful to them and their staff for being able to really take the initiative and put the grant forward and do the heavy lifting with respect to implementation and coordination of the coalition. And so those are kind of a little bit of the background and the key stakeholders with respect to the coalition. Some of the things that I just want to quickly highlight with respect to the Texas Coalition on Coerced Debt of the TCCD is I want to bring to light that we kind of are in a really unique situation in the sense that our coalition is, although it is no longer funded because the grant cycle has expired for us, we have still sustained the project. And we've largely operated from a kind of an egalitarian and equitable framework. Trala was the initiating organization. However, we really did take a partnership approach and really created meetings, calls on a consistent basis with all the stakeholders having the same voice. And so again, even though we had one lead agency, a lot of the times the way that we operated from was from a community building collaborative framework, meaning we all talked about things, we all kind of had to come to decisions and have conversations around what the coalition itself wanted to do and what priorities we wanted to move forward. And so the 4 partner agencies have really kind of served as a bit of a kind of a foundation for the group. We have now since had several different meetings, calls, and outreach efforts. And have grown the membership of the TCCD to about 40 different folks and a variety of different agencies. And the TCCD specifically is looking at the intersection of identity theft in the context of family violence. And so we're looking at, again, at that intersection of coerced debt for folks who are experiencing violence. So it can be in intimate partner relationship violence, elder abuse, youth abuse. Us at the coalition, we obviously have a very unique kind of intersection of domestic violence, and so that has been a priority with respect to the vantage point we are coming into the work from. And so I wanted to kind of bring that to light because I think a lot of, as I've engaged in this work with other coalitions, what I've found is that a lot of them are primarily run by one organization, and then there are a lot of efforts to engage other kinds of organizations in that. And so from our vantage point, we really are operating from kind of a 4-organization foundation and moving forward from there in an effort to engage more folks in a partnership. So it has been a very interesting and really valuable collaboration and coalition because I do think it's really operating from its origin as a coalition from the kind of founding partners. So I want to go ahead and kind of segue us into another component that's really important to the coalition building conversation. And Berneta started off the conversation with telling us a little bit about where she's coming from, what her life experiences and identities are that she brings to the work. And one of the things that you know, we want to talk about too is what we're doing with respect to steps that people are taking with respect to launching a coalition and, you know, what is the work that you're doing in advance of moving into this work itself?
Yeah, so absolutely, definitely type in your comments here in terms of just some steps you've taken before launching a coalition. This is going to be the portion of the webinar where we can sort of talk a little bit about some of the best practices that we ourselves have implemented and in terms of addressing this exact kind of question. So, but I would love to hear from you guys first in terms of just what are some of the things you've done before, whether it's just sort of doing a general search of what other organizations are doing in that space, or tapping into your networks first and maybe even ask them if they feel there's a need for such a coalition, you name it. So definitely give us some feedback here for this question. And I'll give everybody a couple seconds. All right, and I see identify key stakeholders. Any other takers? This question really does get at how do you make sure that you bring the right people to the table, which is always a big, hairy question to ask before launching a coalition or even just deciding to develop one. So I see here I am working on an interagency coalition with law enforcement, legal and community service providers. I'm going to start with the roundtable to discuss best practices for victims. Makes a lot of sense. And I can see how in that roundtable, then you would be able to determine whether or not there's even a need for, a robust coalition in that space. It's a time to broach that question with them, if the coalition isn't already formed. So know your agency's stance and what they will and will not entertain, absolutely. What do you ultimately hope to gain from the coalition? Essentially is what that's getting at. All right. So some general guidelines that I have in terms of launching a coalition is that you really, really want to know the why. You want to know the goal. So it's really getting to this point here that someone mentioned, know your agency's stance and what they will and will not entertain. This can sometimes take the form of drafting a guiding purpose and making sure it aligns with your organizational goals. It may just be sort of an internal thing that you draft for yourself that never gets shared or whatever. But nonetheless, you want to have a really good sense of what your overarching goal is and to make sure that goal lines up with whatever your agency's or your organization's vision or mission is. It's very important to do this just because you don't want to get so far into building a coalition and then realize, wait a minute, this is totally outside our scope of work. Or it's taken us away from our main focus, or it has the wrong tone or whatever it may be. So making sure that you have a purpose sort of laid out and that it lines up with your organizational purpose. All right. This also is really important to do because I think that it can help you determine whether or not you even need a coalition. If you know the goal of the coalition that you're thinking about creating, and you look at that goal and you say, okay, somebody else is already doing this. Some other coalition is already working towards this goal. We don't really need this coalition. Maybe our organization needs to plug in with that coalition that already exists, right? Maybe there are people of color and marginalized communities already leading a coalition angled towards that particular purpose, right? So knowing your goal. Also, once you get to that point and you decide, okay, this goal aligns with my organizational mission, there's not necessarily another coalition that's working towards this specific goal, okay, there's a need for this coalition. Once you get to that point, then it's necessary to determine how you will reach the stated goal. Again, this can require drafting something out, maybe like something that's a short sort of strategic plan potentially, but it could just be as simple as laying out a few bullet points, like these are some of the activities or things that I would like this coalition to be able to do, social media advocacy, whatever. Looking at your old networks to determine who is necessary to bring into this coalition is your next step. Who should you bring into the coalition? What marginalized voices need to be leading this coalition? Who is already in your network that would benefit from being part of this coalition, right? And that you can benefit from having in the coalition. And then once you feel like you have your goals laid out, sort of a semi-strategy in terms of what you will need to do as a coalition to accomplish some of those goals or that goal, and you have a sense of who to invite, then it's just a matter of actually getting started and having a plan for any challenges you will have getting started. Because sometimes we think, oh, we had, these folks involved in a previous coalition and they were super engaged. They will definitely be interested in this coalition that I'm now forming. And you reach out to them and either they're no longer at the organizations that they were with when you worked with them previously, or they're just not as interested anymore for whatever reason. Maybe the organization has moved on to different types of issues and goals and so forth. So it's very important to plan for challenges as you get ready to launch, because you will have a lot of challenges. You may think your coalition will easily reach 30 stakeholders and you manage to get 10 people engaged. And so you just have to plan for those challenges. So just to reiterate, knowing the why, knowing the goal, laying that out, making sure it lines up with your organizational goal. Developing a sort of a strategy of how you're going to reach the stated goal. Bullet points or maybe even a more in-depth strategic plan. Determining who is necessary to include in the coalition to reach those stated goals and to participate in those activities, to carry out those activities. And then finally, planning for challenges. Those are some of the main steps I always suggest taking before you actually launch a coalition. And just keep your head right, in the sense that you don't want to get your hopes up and then realize, okay, once things actually materialize, that this coalition is not turning out what I wanted it to be. There's always going to be a challenge, and there's always a way to grow from the challenge. So, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Mona. Yep, you're still muted. There will always be technical difficulties.
Here we go. Okay, perfect. I am on my cell phone as well, so I think the computer is having a hard time with me being on both, so I apologize. So I wanted to quickly just supplement some of that information. I think one of the things that you know, I have been using really as a result of my TCFB kind of domestic violence state coalition hat, and that's really stood out to me in the work is, you know, to help support the pieces with bringing the right people to the table and creating understanding the why, as well as kind of just turning the steps and what to do and the strategy. I know a lot of folks are familiar with SMART goals, which are those strategic, measurable, ambitious, realistic, time-bound goals. One of the mechanisms that I found out about through my racial equity work was a tool called, instead of using SMART goals, you use SMARTY goals, which is, it takes that foundation of the same kind of 5 pieces and adds on an I in an E. So in addition to having those, you know, strategic, measurable goals, you also are looking specifically at being inclusive, which is the I, and then E, which is equitable. And so inclusive meaning bringing those traditionally marginalized populations to the table, to the process, so that those voices are being included in that. And especially for folks who are working with community building, coalition building, we need to make sure that we are bringing all voices to the table. And so when we adopt measurement tools like this, or engagement tools that would help us, they already systemically have these pieces accounted for, and so it makes it easier for us to think about this at the forefront. And so for the inclusive piece, those traditionally historically marginalized communities being a part of your actual you know, strategic plan at the beginning of that. Being equitable, looking at fairness when it comes to who has a seat at the table, but also do people's voices mean the same as other people? And so I think that's one of the things that, as we talk about not just being inclusive, but also being equitable, how are we making sure that all parties' voices have equal weight, as others? And again, as we build coalitions, as we're building collaborations, it's really important for us to ensure that if we are really wanting to be equitable in this process, that we're looking at all those steps as we're you know, beginning the process, as well as also throughout the process. And a lot of times we create projects, coalitions, initiatives in response to something else, and we have to play catch up. And we'll get to some of these pieces for us in a minute, but that is a lot of times we're kind of thinking about these elements as an after effect. And as we start to really embrace SMARTY goals and really putting inclusivity and equity at the forefront of our projects and our collaborations and our initiatives, then it becomes systemically a part of the conversation, and it's not an afterthought. And I know that, just saying from someone that works in the nonprofit field, that we consistently want to, you know, add more work, and we get asked to add more work. And so as we do this, we really want to be conscientious about the fact that we're trying to build representative, inclusive, and equitable coalitions, and it is not an add-on. This is really an overarching thing that we really, you know, should be prioritizing across any kind of initiative. and not an addition to what we're already doing. And so as we embrace, tools and systems that already have inclusivity and equity as a part of them, it makes it easier across the board for all of us to put that at the forefront of our work. So I just wanted to quickly kind of add that on as well, just to put that out there if folks are not familiar with that. It's a framework and a tool that's I believe was proposed or kind of initiated through the Management Center as an organization. So it's pretty accessible. Google Smarty Goals, and folks can get a hold of those pretty easily.
And Mona, if you don't mind me jumping in and adding to that, I think one thing that has always kind of like been in the forefront of my mind in terms of coalition work, and it doesn't always materialize because sometimes I'm coming in late to a coalition that's already been sort of in the development phase. But when I am the person who's kind of like jumpstarting a coalition, one thing that always comes to mind to me is that folks always say we want to make sure that we have various voices at the table. And I always remind myself, no, we want those voices helping create the table. That's the point here. In the name of equity, we have to make sure that we're not just creating tables and inviting people to come sit at our tables, but we're actually helping people come to, work with us to create new tables that can better be leveraged to uplift their voices with the resources that we have for them to use. So I like to use that as sort of like a capstone and just remind myself of how to like really equitably engage in coalition work, because it's not as straightforward as just being inclusive in that way. So, and I will turn back over to Mona.
Yeah, and so it looks like I just want to read a couple of the some of the feedback here from folks, steps that people have taken before launching a coalition, knowing your agency's stance and what they will or will not entertain, working at an agency coalition with law enforcement, legal, community service providers, and I'm going to start with a roundtable discussion with best practices with victims. That's really important, and it sounds like that's also an important stakeholder, right? Victims themselves, and ensuring that their voices are being heard throughout the process as well. That's kind of a question that's been in the back of my mind with our particular TCCD coalition, is that with this work in particular, I've been contacted by different survivors who've been impacted by coerced debt, and I'm trying to figure out how do we incorporate and make sure that survivor voices are they're a part of the TCCD, and those experiences are there not just as stories to tell, but that they're actively involved if they want to be, in the way that they feel that they're able to, if they want to contribute, or what does that look like? We're kind of in that like conversation phase where we want to make sure that survivor voices are also being brought into the conversation, because the work is for people and they're for survivors. And so again, if we're not ensuring that those voices are being heard and that they have a say-so in the direction of the work, then in some cases, what is the work for? And so that's a really great point, and I'm glad that someone brought that up. As well as the agency piece. Agency support is huge. If you don't have agency support for an initiative, we know that there may not be sometimes capacity from other staff to be able to take things on. Maybe if there is an interest, there is just not funding that might be able to support it, so it limits people's ability to do things. Maybe it's not within the scope of the work. That is something that often gets brought up as well. So that's a conversation piece to be had. And so those are all great pieces to bring up. And we want to ask about as well, what have you done, or what can you do to learn about the community that you serve? And as we're thinking about not just the strategic plan of it, but a lot of times we want to jump into things, and we don't often take the time and the energy and the space to learn about the community that we're serving. I've been in the domestic violence field for quite a while now, over a decade, and sometimes I get into space where I'm like, oh, I know what I'm talking about. I know what my community is, and we might be right. We might have a really good idea, but that does not mean we know it all. And in fact, we are often proven that we don't. And so, you know, communities are changing, people are growing, we are always changing. And so we have to be at a place where we are, you know, coming from a human-centered position, that we're always consistently open to learning about the community that we're serving, and being open to learning new information. We're all working with communities, specifically, again, if we're trying to build coalitions, and we're trying to build coalitions that are representative, inclusive, and equitable. When you're working with people, people are complex. And so we have to be in a position where we are wanting to learn and embrace information and take that in, and not be so rigid that if what we learn isn't already in line with what we planned, that we can't be malleable. And so even if we have a great idea and a great plan, if the information that we learn about a community is not in line with that, then we need to be flexible enough to be able to be malleable and fit the needs of what we're learning. So as we're thinking about that, you know, what are people doing? It looks like community interviews, ask the community what they need. Absolutely. There's other ways to be able to engage. You know, when you're thinking about community surveys, needs assessments are really important tools. I know as a TCCD, we did needs assessments to kind of see what our stakeholders were interested in, what they needed, what they wanted. And again, not just assuming. Some of those things aligned, absolutely, but there were also pieces that we did not take into consideration. Like, for example, there was a key stakeholder with respect to the financial services, you know, industry that we had not really contemplated. And so we were really fortunate that one of our partners was like, oh yeah, I've got some entree into that. And so we were connecting with some different industry folks and banking folks that we weren't normally kind of at the top of our radar. But there's different mechanisms that we also should be engaging with respect to information gathering. We can definitely do really kind of baseline survey information, but how are we kind of going above and beyond and specifically looking to find out more information about our most vulnerable and marginalized communities? So in Texas specifically, we have a very large, predominant historically Latin population in Texas. And so a lot of times, what we tend to see is a lot of focus on the Latino community. And even in some of my coalition work here in Texas, that was one of the things that you know, I stepped into was a lot of immigration work that was specifically targeted at Latino communities. And we had to take a little bit of a step back and be like, well, what other communities are also here? They're immigrant communities, doing some inventory of that. Texas has a large refugee and resettlement population. So there was different communities across Texas that we had to, you know, kind of check ourselves on and saying, how are we being equitable in our immigration work? What are we doing to create the connections and really survey what the diversity amongst our immigrant community look like, and then kind of go from there. So these are pieces that goes to that, you know, kind of being reflective of what we know as well as what we don't know, and then consistently going back to our community here what it looks like, so that again, we're not operating from a we know it all kind of position, but that we're actively engaging with our community to learn more about it because it's consistently changing.
Yeah, absolutely, Mona. And I'll just note too that Wendy over in the chat box mentioned that 2 of them are part of their local human needs network. So helps them stay up to date on most of the community needs development and local resources. So thank you for that comment, Wendy. Definitely figuring out what local networks to plug into just to stay abreast of everything that's going on in the community that you're seeking to serve is really instrumental, really important. We at Georgia Watch, we have a lot of partners who are on the front lines with organizations, so we really truly lean on them to learn as much as we can about community members and to really interface with communities, which takes us to our next question, which is, what are you currently doing to engage traditionally underrepresented and marginalized communities? So definitely type your responses there, and I'll give everybody a couple seconds. And I want to be cognizant of the time too, so that we have plenty of time for everyone to jump in and like ask questions too at the end. So just a couple of seconds. All right. And as everyone is typing their responses, I will just say again, at Georgia Watch, we have, we really rely on our partnerships with grassroots organizations, organizations that are definitely on the front lines. There are community groups, neighborhood groups, groups that are specifically focused on people of color, and equity organizations and so forth, to really be our ears and eyes, and to be the folks that they have the trust of the community. So if we need to really engage the communities directly on some of these sensitive issues, we know that they have the trust with these community members to be able to have those conversations. That would be stranger and a little bit more awkward for us to have as less grassroots organization like ours. So I see here some folks have typed in a couple of comments. Attend functions geared towards domestic violence community outreach. Absolutely. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of showing up and just being present, even if it's just to listen. Sometimes we think, some of our organizations, we think that we need to be on the agenda or speaking at a particular event. Really, the importance of just listening and being there and showing up goes a long way. Speaking to victims and brainstorming ways to improve services, starting with law enforcement, absolutely. Joining task forces and groups, absolutely. I wonder if folks around the call, I wonder if you guys have like hotlines that people call. That's definitely one of the ways that we actually are able to really interface directly with communities that we represent. We do have a hotline, so people call us with all kinds of issues. Whether it's energy bills, utility bills. I think we just lost our PowerPoint, or financial protection issues. There we go, we're back. Identity theft issues. So people call us, and so we are kind of a trusted resource because of our hotline, but that still only gets us so far. So we definitely have to be part of those groups and task forces and so forth. I like this, I love this comment here. We're honest. If we don't know yet how best to serve them, we start our conversation with removing the elephant in the room, and then we follow through by doing our, I'm assuming by doing our research and due diligence and so forth. That's a great comment, absolutely. And so I want to just sort of give you guys a little bit of a sense of how tangibly we've approached our coalition work, good and bad, through the Georgia Identity Theft and Cybercrime Coalition. So our Georgia Identity Theft and Cybercrime Coalition is our newest coalition. We developed it at the beginning of the year, essentially, after realizing in our work with the AG's office and in our work with previous community members who helped do some workshops around the state back in the summer of 2017. We realized there's a need to just keep this material up to date in terms of identity theft and things of that nature. And then, so maybe we should try to keep everybody connected, all right? Instead of just having these one-off train-to-trainer workshops, let's see if we can keep everybody connected. And a coalition seems to have been where we landed. And so we started by just reaching out to folks who were part of those old workshops back in 2017 that we did around the state, and our AG partners and so forth, who are also working on their own cybercrime guide related to small business protection. And we were like, okay, what's the best way to keep people sort of like in touch with each other? First of all, a Google form. That's a really easy way to do this. That's a good way to sort of like, as a platform, to keep people in communication with one another. So then we had the who, folks from our old trainer workshops, AG's office. We had the how in terms of email through our Google form platform. And so then we were like, okay, so how do we start this strategy of just like bringing people into this? Now do we know how we're going to do it? Do we just email folks, call people? So we spent a lot of time calling people first and then emailing them. And within a few months, we managed to get about at least 6 or 7 people like actually joined on the Google platform, the Google form. Now, some folks that we reached out to were part of other coalitions that we lead, so we didn't want them feeling like they had to do triple or double duty. So we didn't bother them as much. As I got brought into this, because I was not at the very start of this coalition, I kind of came in a little bit later, but as I got brought into it, I just made a point to pick up the phone and call even more people that had previously worked with us, and just probably folks who wanted up-to-date information for their communities that they serve. And As of today, we have I think we have at least 15 members who are in our Google form. And then that's not excluding the people who still are on our email list for when we do send out emails, but they never actually joined the Google form. So nonetheless, you think, okay, 20 or so members, that sounds great, but how many of them actually participate in the calls? And that's the hiccup. You're always going to have to plan for challenges, as I said before. So despite the fact that we have a decent number of people who are in our Google form and who get our emails, we never have more than, say, 10 people or something who join our calls. But the important aspect there is that they are very engaged. They're members of senior organizations. Seniors are a huge demographic that's targeted for identity theft. There are AG partners who have a broad audience, obviously. And then there are partners who work at credit unions who have invested interest in this space. But nonetheless, I wanted to lay out to you how we went about developing this latest coalition, this identity theft coalition, because it's not the same way that we went about developing our other two coalitions, because we recognize that the approach that we need to take in developing each coalition will depend on the specific goals of that coalition. So you may ask, what is the actual goal of this coalition? It really is to keep people informed and up to date about identity theft issues that are pressing and common in Georgia. And specifically, our stated purpose that we start out every meeting with, or our stated outline, is that the Georgia Identity Theft and Cybercrime Coalition convenes service providers, stakeholders, community leaders, and subject matter experts in annual convenings, regular webinars, and via a digital forum to discuss identity theft and cybercrime in Georgia. So I'm not gonna talk too much because I could go on and on about it. But again, I want to be cognizant of the time and turn it back over to Mona as we're kind of sort of wrapping up here a little bit.
Thank you, Berneta. Sorry, it sounds like there was a bit of feedback.
Oh no, I don't hear any, so.
Okay. So one of the things I would add with respect to engagement of traditionally underrepresented and marginalized communities, again, kind of coming from that dual hat of the state coalition for domestic violence survivors, one of the things that we've been fortunate to do is take all that knowledge that we had from the other coalition and really use it as a way to help shape the engagement work we're doing with the TCCD. Specifically, I think there's two pieces that we're looking at. We're looking at the internal engagement with respect to what are we internally as the four kind of partner agencies doing to engage our membership and specifically broaden the membership, as well as identify folks already within our membership who are coming from underrepresented or marginalized communities. And so the internal work for us at the TCCD is important. One of the things that we've done recently is create a statement that's going to go out to our current email list, as well as we move forward, create an inclusivity statement that is specifically proactively reaching out to communities of color. And so we've added that to our, a really kind of basic intro pieces with respect to an engagement strategy. And it's a pretty basic, but I think a very important piece, which is something along the lines of, inclusion of all voices makes our coalition flourish. And we're seeking to actively, proactively prioritize, we value representation from all communities, and for people who may be underrepresented marginalized communities, this includes people of color who identify as LGBTQ+ or gender non-conforming, individuals with disabilities, and people who speak a language in addition to English or other than English. And so for us, it seems like it might be a very kind of easy thing to think about, but you will be surprised how often we are not proactively engaging our communities that we know are affected the most by our work. And so it's something that was really important to me to say we need to proactively say we are speaking to this community, and we're speaking to our communities who are really face additional barriers to be involved in this process. We also added preferred pronouns to ensure that people, as they engage with our with our particular coalition feel that they are referred to in the pronouns that they prefer, and so that we're being respectful and inclusive in that way. And then also an element, again, just with like external communication and engagement is identifying that folks may need additional accommodations in order to really effectively participate in our coalition itself, not outside trainings, not outside meetings, but just even being a part of the stakeholder meetings and conversations with us, and creating that platform of all equal voices at the table. We realize there may be folks who don't speak, English as a primary language. And so how do we accommodate participation in that way? And so that's another question that has been added to our Google engagement form for our members as we move forward. And so they're really important pieces that, again, it sounds like they should be kind of second nature to us, but a lot of times they end up being reactive and not proactive. And so it's something that, again, as we have that kind of SMARTY goal, that's what I use for my own accountability and my checklist to make sure that we're thinking about these pieces at the forefront, proactive pieces of the work. So those are some things that, I wanted to kind of share. The other piece I would just say is, again, like with respect to the work, we also have to think about engagement with representation. And so I used to work with a colleague of mine that used to always say, no decision about us without us. And so representation matters because of that. And there are a lot of times decisions that are being made, again, with our most historically marginalized and oppressed populations that don't include the people that they're impacting. And so one of the things that I have been really, it just kind of onset and hit me as I was thinking about this presentation today was that we are very fortunate on our coalition as our primary kind of stakeholder group with those 4 coalition partners. We have 4 women of color on that kind of foundational team. And we all come from different and diverse backgrounds. Don't get me wrong. Again, we're not kind of making people sound like they're all one person. But out of the 7 stakeholder primary partnership people here, there are 4 women of color. That is it's not a common thing. And so I wanted to bring that to light because that is a really positive piece. And one of the things that we ran into, and it was a colleague of mine, I'm a Latina, I'm a cis woman, I come from San Antonio, which is about an hour and a half south of here. And my family is of Mexican heritage, but I'm a second generation Latina in Texas. And so I was raised in a bilingual household, or family, I should say. But it's not my first language. I, can kind of barely get by at times. And it's important, but we came to a really important kind of piece where history, language access, and representation came to the forefront because we were trying to figure out how do we say coercive debt and coercive control in Spanish in a way that would be relevant to the people that are speaking it and not just Google translated, because if there are people from the community that we are representing that don't understand it, what good does it do? And so when we're thinking about, again, even these small pieces of, what might be considered language access, it's more than that. It's how is this actual information meeting the people? Is it making sense? Does it make sense? Do we need to create words that don't even exist right now for this kind of work? And so having people that represent the community that they're serving is really important, because even my colleague, I kind of got into a conversation about like, what does that mean? And here is the literal definition, and like, well, is that going to be something that's relatable to people, and or is it not going to connect? So I wanted to just bring that to light with respect to the internal foundation of folks who are working on these coalitions. Not just external engagement and making sure that we've got people that are representative, but also us, the people who are making those, really consistent conversations, that are making decisions with respect to building coalition, that, again, those are done in line with the community and as a part of that. So I just wanted to share that really quick.
Yeah, that's a really powerful testimony there, Mona. And I want to just make sure that everyone knows that on our set part 2, we're going to talk a lot more about engagement. So don't feel like you didn't get some of those questions in there, that we cut that short, because that's going to be the focus of our next discussion. I do want to make sure that people have time to ask any questions. I've put in the chat box to definitely type any questions you have for us at this particular point in the presentation as we get ready to wrap up here. So any lingering thoughts or questions? And then I'm sure a lot of folks have questions about just like engagement generally. And again, I just wanted to scratch the surface of engagement issues in this presentation. That is going to be the focus of Wednesday's webinar concluding this. But any other questions, not about engagement, but more so just about like launching and just sort of like bringing the right people to the table? Has anyone felt like they've launched a coalition and they realized after they launched, they just did not have the right people at the table and they weren't sure where to go after that? Because that's happened to me. And I will say that when that has happened to me, my first step is always to kind of take a look at what the goal is, first of all, and to recognize, okay, the folks that I currently have at the table, they're great. It's not necessarily about them not being good enough for this coalition or being the right fit for the coalition. I just need to bring in other folks. And what I've done in other coalitions to remedy that problem is immediately go to some of those frontline organizations that we work with and ask them, okay, what do you think about this coalition? Is there any way that this coalition can help you? Because one thing that is very important in this work and trying to make sure that we're being equitable is that we're not extractive. We don't want to be extracting the labor of marginalized communities and groups that represent those communities, and then not giving some sort of like, something to them that they can use, that they can leverage. And so I always, in that situation, I made sure I went to frontline organizations and was like, okay, how can this coalition help you? Would you mind joining and helping shape it in a way that can most benefit you and both of us? And so sometimes that really meant in that particular case, going back to the drawing table and kind of drafting a semi-strategic plan with those new folks that really needed to be there in the first place. That way it felt like something that could be owned by the communities that we were trying to serve. They just didn't end up at the table when we first launched. So there are ways to sort of like fix a problem in launch phase if you realize after you've launched that, okay, the right people aren't at the table. There's no need to scrap the entire coalition. There are ways to fix it. So, any other thoughts from anyone around the call, around the webinar? Oh, if not, I will turn it back over to Mona for last thoughts, and we'll kind of wrap up. I hear you, Mona, I think.
Okay, sorry, the computer was giving me a little bit of a hard time today, so I apologize. So I'm glad that you mentioned just the kind of final engagement strategies with respect to, or excuse me, kind of final who's missing and who's at the table pieces. And we do have a second part to the webinar. Today really is just the kind of beginning of the conversation. We'll have a more kind of exhaustive information on Wednesday for the follow-up piece to that. And I think one of the things that you mentioned was that a lot of our coalitions are just kind of starting off, like both your coalition and our coalition are less than a year old, and we've actually kind of concluded our work as a formal kind of quote unquote coalition. But so a lot of these strategies are in the beginning stages. And so just kind of like our conversation today, this is the beginning stage of the rest of, and we'll be kind of tailoring in and hopping into more stuff on Wednesday. That's kind of my final thought. Just this is the beginning. I'm glad that we've had these kind of conversations. I hope there are some percolating in people's minds happening. One of the last things that I would say that I would leave people with and hope that they will join us again on Wednesday is if you didn't have a chance to really think about what you bring to the table with respect to your identities and your lived experiences, think about that. So that way on Wednesday, we can have that at the forefront of the engagement strategies and how you and your work and your experience tailor and really feed into the work that we're doing with respect to building inclusive and representative communities and coalitions. And we'll have some more kind of meat and potatoes on Wednesday with respect to the engagement strategies and sustainability. Again, we're both kind of in those phases where we're how do we kind of sustain this and what are we doing? And so we're all learning together. And I would just leave us on, you know, that we are in a place of growth and vulnerability and humility to where we're all learning this kind of together. And I think that that's one of the positives is that we're here to support each other in that same way. As we grow and as we become organizations that are sustainable and that are equitable and that are inclusive and representative of the community that we're trying to serve. Laura, can I bring you back in to close this out?
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Berneta and Mona for sharing this information with us and for leading this discussion. I know this is a bit of a non-traditional way to do a webinar, but I really enjoyed it, and I hope everybody who attended did as well. So don't forget, on Wednesday, we have part 2 of the webinar. It's going to start an hour earlier. So it's going to be starting at noon Eastern time. That's 12 o'clock noon Eastern time. And it'll be a similar format. So you know, like Mona said, do some thinking about this and be ready for some more thought-provoking questions and discussion. So thank you to Mona and Berneta. Thank you to all of our attendees. And if you have any questions, their emails are there too. Feel free to send them an email or bring those questions on Wednesday for part 2. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.